A sermon for the third Sunday after Trinity. The struggle for power in this world is a serious business. We've only got to look at the problems in the Middle East, Afghanistan, and elsewhere. History is littered with destruction and death because of it. As we see from our readings this evening, power is not easily shared. As Christians, how should we react to the power seekers? How should we compete for or resist power? In our Old Testament reading, we have the power struggle between Saul and David. Last week, we were told of the worsening relationship between them. David was no longer the favoured musician of the court, the revered champion who defeated Goliath, the much-loved member of Saul's household. Too many good things were happening to him. His popularity was growing too fast. Throughout Israel, women were praising his name above Saul's. Saul has struck down thousands, but David tens of thousands, they were saying. He was becoming too powerful, and Saul kept a jealous eye on him. Saul's jealousy blinded him so much that he even tried to kill David, forcing him to run and become an outlaw. No food, no friends, no protection. He goes to a priest for help. Ahimelech rushes out to meet him, but he's uneasy. A man in David's position would not travel without an escort. When questioned, David lies about why he's there, claims he's on a special mission for the king. His real motive is to get some food. But the only bread available is consecrated bread, bread from the 12 loaves that were baked every week on the Sabbath and brought to the holy place in the tabernacle. Each loaf represents a tribe of Israel and is dedicated to God. After 7 days, the priests were given the bread to eat, but only in the holy place, and 12 fresh loaves are brought in to replace them. David readily accepts the bread, knowing its significance. As Jesus points out later to the Pharisees, eating the consecrated bread is not in itself wrong, because it was given to save life. It's more important that man's needs are met than the ceremonial niceties are kept. God requires mercy, not sacrifice. David asks for a weapon, not the usual request you make to a priest, but the only one available is the sword of Goliath, the one in which he dedicated to God after defeating the giant. Again, he takes back what he has given to God. David's mistake was that he put his own needs before God's instead of trusting in God's power. He relies on his own. This had severe consequences for the priests, because when Saul found out that they helped him, he had them killed. For David, there was more humiliation to come. He goes to a Philistine country, leaving the people of God for the enemies of God, hoping to slip in an unobserved and be taken on in service to Achish, their king. But this was Gath, home of Goliath, and his face and Goliath's sword were too well known. Surely this is David, the king of his country. He panicked, started to feign insanity, even foam at the mouth. Fortunately, David's life is spared. He's frog-marched out of the city. David was clearly going through a bad patch. He survived, but only just. And as we see later, God used this painful period in his life to bring him closer to maturity, to prune him spiritually. As C.S. Lewis once wrote, God whispers to us in our pleasures, but shouts to us in our pain. As for Saul, he lacked real faith in God. He failed to obey God's commands passed to him through Samuel. When he was finally rejected as king, his emotional and psychological state of mind disintegrated. After failing in many attempts to take David's life, Saul eventually took his own. David went on to greater things under God's guidance. He would eventually be known as the greatest king of Israel and ancestor to the most powerful king ever known to man. So we come to our second power struggle between Jesus and the Jewish leaders. Like ripples in a pool of water, Jesus' ministry was beginning to have a widening impact on the Jewish people, so much so that the opposition took a more open assault on his kingship. Jesus had just healed a man who, in the words of St. Luke, was possessed by a demon who was dumb. This man's illness was so severe that he couldn't speak until Jesus released him from his physical and mental prison. He drives demons out by Beelzebub, they said, which in Jesus' time was a name they used for the devil. If the Pharisees could persuade the people that Jesus was a demon, then everything he taught and did would be discredited. Others in the crowd demanded a sign as proof that he was God. Jesus responded with some simple truths. Every kingdom divided against itself is laid waste. A divided household falls. If Jesus is on the devil's team, then surely he's just scored an own goal. The devil would want him, increasing people's anxiety, not freeing them from it. No team will succeed if it has its own players kicking against it. And what about the Pharisees' own followers, who claim to do similar things? If the Pharisees are right, it would mean that they're in the devil's team too. So having defeated their argument, Jesus pushes his own teaching forward. If he's not the devil, then Jesus must be with God, which means the signs and miracles he performs are through the hand of God. God's kingdom has arrived. It's here with them through Jesus, and he is much more powerful than the devil because he drives out Satan's demons. The Pharisees didn't want to admit that Jesus is God or that his power is from God, but Jesus defeated their argument by proclaiming the truth and trust in God's power and strength, unlike David, who fell into the trap of self-interest and deceit. The Pharisees were on a very dangerous ground by calling the work of the Holy Spirit evil. They were evicting God's only avenue to save them, putting themselves in complete darkness. So what does all this mean for us in our power struggles? Well, in verse 23, Jesus tells us, "He who is not with me is against me, and he who does not gather with me scatters." Not only is Satan Jesus' enemy, but also anyone who does not respond rightly to Jesus is his enemy. In other words, being neutral, sitting on the fence, is the same as being against. He explains it by using a short story about an unclean spirit. If someone is a neutral, in other words, not for the God or not for the devil, he's empty, vulnerable, just like Saul chose to be, and just like David when he decided to lie to the priests. The devil will use all his strength to defeat any we do to resist. What Jesus is telling us is that our evil thoughts must be crowded out, not by trying to shut them out, but by keeping God in. We haven't got to focus on the things we do wrong, but to make sure one thing we do right, and that's to let God fully occupy every bit of our lives. Listen and involve him in everything we do. As Jesus tells the woman at the end of our reading, the most important thing is that we must hear the word and obey it. Jesus releases sin from us. The tools of the devil, brings us the power of the Spirit, which is stronger than anything Satan can muster against us. So are we serious about winning for Christ, about fighting against the forces of evil in the world, in our own lives? We've got to stop being a floating voter, a fence sitter, a neutral. We must commit ourselves wholeheartedly to Jesus Christ. It's the only way to live, the only way to receive real power in this world and the next. Amen.